On May 9, 2022, the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. John McWhorter, invited speaker for the 2022 Apple Lecture Series, hosted by the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. McWhorter is an associate professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He earned his BA from Rutgers, his MA from NYU, and his PhD in linguistics from Stanford. Dr. McWhorter is the author of more than a dozen books, including The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language, Losing the Race, Self-Sabotage in Black America, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English, and Words on the Move, Why English Won't and Can't Sit Still, like literally. His most recent book, published in 2021, is called Woke Racism: How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. He also regularly contributes to newspapers and magazines, including The New Republic, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. We'd like to thank Dr. McWhorter for taking the time to do this interview, and we're very excited to hear his thoughts on the topics of language change, language use, and the field of linguistics. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. McWhorter. On behalf of the Studies of Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal at Teachers College, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we'll jump right in. We'd like to start off on a more personal note and ask you a bit about your career trajectory.
So I will start with the first two questions. The first one is about why you chose linguistics. So was there a particular course or scholar that inspired you to pursue a career in linguistics?
No, I don't have that kind of story. My career trajectory was based more on chance than I think a lot of people have any way of knowing. And I just knew when I was in college that the thing I enjoyed most was playing around with foreign languages just because I found the languages interesting. It wasn't even the culture in particular. It would sound better if I said that, but it wasn't about learning how other people live and think. It was the linguistic systems that interest me. And I gradually realized that there was a subject called linguistics that was all about that. And for lack of any other subject that I felt I could realistically embrace, I realized that I knew I wanted to get a PhD in something, and I figured by process of elimination, it must be this thing called linguistics. And it's easy to not know what linguistics is from the outside, and I certainly didn't. And I was lucky that what it turned out to be was something that I could handle and become interested in, because it's one thing to like teaching yourself a little Spanish and Italian, it's another thing to actually study linguistics. And I found, after getting used to it for a couple of years, that it was something that I really loved. And that's how it happened. And so it wasn't that I had a particularly charismatic linguistics teacher. I didn't take a proper linguistics course as an undergrad. And it wasn't that there was some book that I read or something like that. It was just that I knew I was a little professor. And the question was, what was I going to be a professor in? And languages seemed to be the thing.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the next question is about a little bit later, right? More recent years where you now contribute regularly to Lexicon Valley, the podcast, to the Atlantic and the New York Times, and maybe some other publications that we're now aware of. Can you share a little bit about how did you get into like being a regular contributors to these outlets?
All of that has also been by chance. I didn't choose it. I never knew that I would be somebody who was both an academic and a media writer. It just kind of happened. A good 25 years ago, I found that I was out of step with the usual orthodoxy in educated circles on race. And I like to have my point, and I happen to have a particular gift, which is that I write fast. I write ridiculously quickly. And so it's not hard for me to express myself in writing. And so I wrote some things for some very obscure outlets. And one thing gradually led to another, because it's unusual for a Black person with a PhD to not have a certain range of views that you might be familiar with from people like Ibram Kendi. And so you don't have a whole lot of competition, and people are interested in quote unquote diversity of views. And so I wrote a book called Losing the Race back in 2000 that was a minor hit. And that got me asked by various publications to write now and then. And it just kind of gradually built. And I never thought that I would be writing for the New York Times at all. I had occasionally done book reviews for them, the occasional opinion piece, but I always thought that my views were out of step with what they would want to publish regularly. But we live in strange times, and the Times was under pressure and criticism for pushing away various writers who didn't toe the line. And I think that was part of why last year they decided to make a statement by bringing me on. But it was not something I ever expected. But for me, it's a duty, because I really do feel that the views that I have on race are not conservative. They're not unusual. They're views that a great many Black people have. But educated Black people often don't express them in public, or if they do, they pad them so much that they might as well not have said it. And so really, for me, the linguistics is the joy. The race writing, although it's at the point where I hate to admit that it's more of what I do than the linguistics, is a duty. There's no joy in that. But if I don't do it, frankly, very few other people will. And so I'm getting that message out there. But it was really just a matter of chance. If somebody asks you to write, you're not going to say no. But I never thought I shall also be a media essayist. I am going to pursue a career where I get lots of attention and make extra money. I'm not that targeted. It all just kind of happened.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And so the next few questions will be about your lecture at Teachers College on April 29th, titled What Will Language Be Like in 2100 AD? When talking about how globalization kills off languages, you mentioned that in order for a language to propagate, the language must be taught in the cradle rather than learned by adults. In elaborating on this, you seem to make reference to the critical period hypothesis, which in a nutshell suggests that learning a language after 13 years of age is nearly impossible. Could you please elaborate on how the critical period hypothesis is relevant to the study of language change?
Well, in general, it is pretty well established that there is an ossification that happens in the ability to learn to speak a language perfectly. And so after 13, you may have really excellent idiomatic command, but you're probably going to have an accent, and your idioms might be a little off now and then. It's just something that never happens as easily or successfully after a certain age. And why that's interesting in terms of language change, although this is not something that you find in the textbooks yet, is that there are many languages that are profoundly affected by the fact that at some point they were learned more by people over 13 or 14 than by people who were children. And what happens then is not that the language becomes some sort of pidgin, but it means that that language ends up having fewer bells and whistles than the languages related to it that are always passed on natively. And so that's had a major effect on various languages around the world. The extreme example is what happens when a Creole language forms, when adults really do learn a pidgin level of a language, but then they need to use it for the rest of their lives. Human beings need more than a pidgin to be themselves. And so you take the pidgin and you make it into a new language. But that happens to intermediate degrees. And that is why English, to speak in a very crude way, has less grammar than Icelandic. They are born of the same original ancestral language, but English is easier. And that's because Vikings kind of shaved it down. From the English perspective, the idea that Mandarin has 4 tones, contrastive tones, seems very complicated. But Mandarin's 4 tones are nothing compared to Cantonese's 9. The normal state of Chinese is to have 6 or 9 tones. Mandarin only having 4 is because it's the one that was learned the most by adults a very long time ago. So you see that sort of thing all over the world. And that's why the critical age hypothesis can be interesting in terms of thinking about how languages change.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much. So also in your lecture on April 29th, you mentioned that spoken or oral language changes more rapidly than does written language.
Mhm.
Does the rate of language change depend on the register? For instance, might written language used in informal contexts, such as text messaging, evolve at a faster rate than language used in formal contexts, such as empirical reports?
Yeah, I think more properly, you might say that casual language evolves more quickly. And that means that even casual writing, which is a lot like speech, changes. So that, for example, it was about 10 years ago now that people started writing papers about what texting language was like. Those papers and articles are now already obsolete. All sorts of things have happened because texting is like speech in that way. And so formal writing tends to change very slowly. But casual writing changes as quickly often as speech does, because that's the nature of casual communication.
Great, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Thank you. My question is related to your lecture on April 29th as well. In that lecture, you introduced many linguistic features distinct to specific languages. For
Mhm.
instance, Chinese is a tonal language, while French marks gender. So it
Mhm.
is incredible to learn how different languages are used. And you're probably aware of a hypothesis called linguistic relativity or Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the hypothesis states that people speaking different languages think differently. For instance, German as a non-aspectual language, so German speakers tend to describe actions and motions from a more holistic perspective by habitually including the endpoints and destinations of action and motion, while speakers of an aspectual language like Russian or English probably pay less attention to endpoints. So linguistic relativism essentially thinks there is a close relationship between language and mind. So I'm just wondering what's your opinion on linguistic relativism?
The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is very tempting. You want that to be true. You want to look at languages' grammars and think that that shows how the people who speak the language think, and that if you learn that language, you might learn to think in a new way. But you have to be very careful about it, because the thing about language is that for every cool thing that you see in a language, or you think, wow, that language makes you more sensitive to blue, or that language makes you more sensitive to the endpoints of things, there's something about the language that frankly makes the speakers look like idiots. And you can't say that the things that are uncool don't work because they're mean, but that the things that are cool work because they're fun. That's not science. And really, my inclination is to think that languages have different grammars, and that those grammars lead you to think about certain aspects of life to some infinitesimal degree. You can find that in psychological experiments. But to think of that as a worldview ends up insulting people. And so, for example, to take Mandarin again, Mandarin is very hazy when it comes to counterfactuals compared to a European language. To say something like, if you had only known that she was there, then you could have seen through the wall. To have the could and the have, and to put that precisely in Mandarin isn't necessary. There's no way to get that across precisely. Maybe something like ngai hui, but you don't need to. You really can just say, if you knew, then you saw through the wall. That's the way you express yourself in Chinese. Now, you might want to go from that to say that to be a Chinese speaker is to be less sensitive to the counterfactual, but that's very close to saying that you're less intelligent, honestly, and nobody wants to go there. And there actually was a psychologist who tried that. There are people writing against that article to this day, and he wrote the original article in 1980 because nobody wanted to hear that. And that just shows you the danger. There are languages where you can say that somebody is more tall than another person, but you can't say that somebody is less tall than another person. There's no less. Because if you want to say someone's less tall than another person, you could say that the other person is more tall. You don't need the less, although from English, or in this case, Mandarin, it seems like you would need it. For people like that, you think, well, you only have more, but you don't have less. That looks like you're less sensitive to very basic comparative relations. Now, of course, we know that they're not. It's just that the language isn't. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis does show that languages can affect thought to an infinitesimal degree that you can find in a very artificial psychological experiment. And that's interesting in itself. But the idea that it's a worldview such that you might bring this sort of thing into a court case, saying that the language a person speaks makes them less sensitive to one thing than another, that would be really dangerous, because every language has things that make its speakers look like they're kind of dim as well as kind of sophisticated. And you can't, if you want the grits, you have to have the gravy. And so I wrote a book called The Language Hoax, where I tried to get that across. And, predictably, some anthropologists find that book really noxious, because they tend to really like the idea that your language is your thoughts, and especially that a non-Western language makes people more sophisticated and more sensitive to the world than a boring Western person speaking English or German. I understand that bias, but beyond those people, I think the language hoax has been accepted as making a valid statement. And I made it because I wanted to protect people from the larger implications of it.
Thank you.
So my next question is about your lecture and the topic of language change and also pedagogical implications. So in your lecture and also in many of your works, such as the book Words on the Move, your TED Talk on texting, you talk about how language is constantly changing. And most of us here are language researchers and also language teachers. And we certainly subscribe to the descriptive view of language as opposed to the prescriptive view. But as language teachers, as English teachers, we have to decide what to teach as correct or accurate versus incorrect. And so while we recognize the arbitrariness of prescriptive grammar rules and dictionary definitions, we still have to teach, to some extent, a right way to speak English. So I'm curious if you have any advice for teachers of English or other languages on how we can address these ideas of language change in our classrooms.
Well, I think that we need to start teaching people as a default concept that it's normal to have two or more levels to how you speak a language. We tend to teach according to an idea that the right way is the standard, and then that there's this colloquial way that doesn't belong on the page and isn't worth talking about in the classroom. There seem to be two extremes. One is to teach as if the standard is all there is. The other is to teach that the vernacular is authentic and the standard is something alien and it's a gatekeeper, et cetera, et cetera. And that latter view, I get it. That's good leftism, but it doesn't really help somebody who wants to succeed in a society where, for better or for worse, and maybe it's worse, the standard is what's seen as the lingua franca in the more legitimate form. So I think that we need to teach language as having levels in that way. I think most people in the world spontaneously understand that. There are varying extents to which people think of the quote unquote low language as low, but human beings can speak more than one thing. Bilingualism and multilingualism are norms. Bidialectalism is a norm, but we tend to think of language in an artificial way as something frozen on the page in an artificially standardized form. It's understandable why we think of it that way, but I think that advanced teaching would be to let people know there are two ways with different domains and that both of them are legitimate.
Thank you.
So the next question takes us back to your lecture, and it focuses on one of the questions that was raised in the Q&A section. And it's also related to Callie's question about dialectal differences. So when responding to one of the audience questions about dialect and social justice, you mentioned that there are cultural and social factors rather than Black English alone that contributed to racial achievement gap in the US. And I'm thinking about a number of scholars, including Geneva Smitherman, April Baker Bell, who suggested that attitudes or bias or prejudice against Black English continue to be institutionally and academically consequential. So I'm curious about your thoughts on whether what can be done to achieve linguistic justice in the education system, and is it possible to challenge the dominance of what Baker Bell called white mainstream English?
Carol, I'm a little underqualified here because I don't teach children, and these are not issues that are of concern in the schools that my own children go to. But I would say that yes, to the extent that Black English is seen by teachers as a bad thing and corrected and, stomped on, that certainly will not help Black kids feel good about school, to the extent that the achievement gap is partly a matter of Black kids' attitude towards school, and it is. That sort of dialect prejudice certainly would not help. If you feel in school that the way you're most comfortable talking is looked down upon by the people in authority, naturally school is going to seem like something else. My horse sense, and that's really all it is that since the 90s, the general attitude among teachers towards quote unquote ebonics has improved. The Oakland controversy in 1996 and 1997 was just a hot mess in itself, but I think it did create a sense that there's this thing called ebonics that's legitimate. And I think that the public kind of laughed at this, but I think that a lot of educators got a certain kind of message. My impression is that the white teacher who thinks of Black English as a bad thing and makes no bones about it is rarer now than two generations ago, but probably there's still work that needs to be done. What I know is that a great many people in education theory in general have this gatekeeper idea. They very much understand that vernacular language is okay, and it's the standard language that they're wary of. How much that attitude percolates into how actual teachers teach day to day, I don't know, because I'm not an education specialist, but frankly, I hope it doesn't.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have two more questions related to language use, and those questions were abstracted from two articles that I read.
Mm-hmm.
So in one article you published in Atlantic in May 2020, you pointed out that the online education crisis as the impact of the COVID forces schools to go online. And you mentioned that children learning at home through screens miss critical aspects of language, in a particular formal language in the form of writing, whereas bilingual children have more exposure to their home language and heritage language. So the inference I draw from this article is that the opportunity to use formal language in classroom setting is important. And the input flood of a heritage language at home also plays an essential role in language development. So I wonder, from the perspective of a second language acquisition perspective, which variable is more important? Is it the opportunity of is it the opportunity to use language, or the abundance of language input?
Well, actually, the most important aspect of input is that it comes from several people and from several contexts. You can only get so good at a language if you only use it with, for example, your grandmother. You need more people, you need more situations, you need it to be out in the world. And I wrote that Atlantic article, frankly, because I couldn't think of anything else at the time and I needed to put something in. But it's actually turned out, there are a couple of studies that show that heritage language ability among some people did improve somewhat during the major lockdown. But then the effect tended to go away once things opened up a little bit. Because the truth is, you talk like your peers. You don't talk like your parents unless you lead an extremely conservatively hermetic existence. And we all know that parents can have thick accents in English, their children will not. And so what you find is that it's ordinary to have different levels of command of languages. Perfect bilingualism is rare. But yeah, heritage language is important, but it's better if you grow up using the language in a community in general. Now, formal language, being exposed to it, that happens in school more. It happens from the printed page. It happens from media as well. But with that second language, what really helps is a broad range of experience. If it's just grandma, or if it's even just the parents, it's not as effective. And you can see that with different heritage languages around the United States.
That's so true. So my second question is that is from one of the articles you published in 2016. I think it's also from the Atlantic. And you, in that article, you analyzed the use of like in American English. Mm-hmm. And you've identified 3 types, or more precisely, 3 meanings encoded in the real life use of like. And you said that like has become a piece of grammar, and the meaning associated with like has changed. like functions in the pragmatic department with model wings. And a metaphor you used in that article makes so much sense to me, in that you said that language is a film rather than a photo, in motion rather than at rest. Language is something becoming rather than being. So my follow-up question to that metaphor is that if language is a film, then who's the director or who's the backstage editor of that film, and who are the actors of this film, and who has the right to change the language, and what roles do language users play, and what roles do second language users play, and how can we tell if the meaning of the language has changed, and is the changing process of a commutative process, and if so, at what point could we identify there is a new grammar?
The thing about how language changes that is really hard to get a grip on when you're actually speaking it or watching it is how much of it is about chance. We think a word means something and we're communicating what we mean. But the thing is, with human experience, anything that happens, anything that we're perceiving, the language is only going to communicate roughly 40% of what it is. One language will be concerned with the shapes of things. One language will be concerned with the difference between the and and that's many fewer languages than people often understand. One language will divide the past into 5 or 6 different categories. Most languages won't have that many. And so language is approximate, and it's always drifting and, you know, sticking a finger up into the air and maybe going into one of the places that it hadn't gone before. And it's unsatisfying to say that there isn't always a reason for that. To an extent, it's just that it's water flowing down some dry gully, and, you know, who knows which way it's going to happen to go, and it's not going to completely cover the bottom. That really is the way it is. And so it isn't quite like animal evolution, where whatever's going on for the most part is for some purpose. Genes get propagated because something was an advantage. Most of the way language moves along is chance. There's a certain basic toolkit that all languages have, and then there's excess, and you never quite know. Now, who is responsible for it? It's a subconscious process. Something starts with one person that happens to catch on, and that's called actualization. And people study it, and no one is completely sure exactly why one thing might catch on. But once it does, it tends to be women who do it first. Women are the lead actors in this way. No one quite knows why, but it seems to have something to do with women being more comfortable with being linguistically creative than men. Some people say it's that women have closer social networks. I don't know what that means, but I'm just throwing that out there because people seem to like that idea. But I frankly think it's more that men are more repressed about being creative and expressive than women. So women tend to lead it, but then again, it's unsatisfying to say it's subconscious. Women don't know that they're changing things. It's that you look back and you see that it's always the women who started doing it first, usually younger women. And next thing you know, you've got new forms. Now, when does it become a new language? There's no line that you can draw, and that doesn't usually happen these days much at all, because we have print that holds things back. But you can see that that happened in the past because one thing led gradually to another. And so, for example, if modern English were spelled the way it's pronounced, it would be clear that Old English was one language and modern English is very much another one, or that Middle English was one language and modern English is another one. Modern English looks like Middle English on the page because of our conservative spelling system, but really the vowels turned completely upside down in a way that really made this practically a new language. You can't see it, but it certainly happened. What we can see is that our spelling system makes no sense. And then there are all sorts of grammatical things that have happened. So yeah, it's a random process of morphing, as I call it. I don't like to say evolve because that makes it seem like there's a purpose. It's not devolving because it's not that there's less of anything. It just morphs. And next thing you know, you have a new thing.
So for the next couple of questions, we'd like to ask you about your ability to connect with a wider audience. And I'll start with a specific question, and I'm going to quote you, if you don't mind. In the acknowledgements section of your book, Words on the Move, you say, "It's easy for an academic to quietly dismiss what laymen tend to ask as beside the point, not what we really study. Best dispensed with as quickly, albeit politely, as possible, in the hope of getting across at least a little of the real stuff. However, I've increasingly found that these questions from the outside often stimulate thoroughly interesting investigations." So our question for you is, how do you go about taking a layman question and figuring out how to answer it with linguistic research? Or perhaps you could share an example of how you've done this in the past.
That's interesting. Yeah, when you are translating in a way that people will want to listen to, you gradually realize what interests people, and you kind of split the difference between what interests you as an academic and what interests real people. The idea being to teach real people a little something, but realizing that to an extent, what you like is weeds that really need not interest real people. And it took me a while to completely get that. And so, for example, English interests me much less than many people would think. My idea was always to study something other than what I already spoke, especially since English is a relatively uncomplex language grammatically in many ways. But I gradually realized, especially about 15 years ago, that for the general public, people who are interested in language tend to be most interested in the language that they speak, as opposed to a linguist. And so I started paying more attention to English and the history of English, because I realized if I want to teach people about language change and language contact and even what grammar is, it won't do to keep referring to German and Spanish and Arabic and Hebrew. Most people just don't care about that. And I realized I get it. I can imagine being somebody who doesn't care about all of that. That's my sickness. And so now, I can teach a course on the history of English. I couldn't have done that 20 years ago, but the reason I can do that now is because I've had to bone up on English, because I've realized that that's what most people find interesting. And after a while, I found that I find it interesting too. It helps to be somebody who likes going into places that they haven't gone before. But then also there is using modern popular culture to the extent that one can. It's one thing to refer to sophisticated novels. It's one thing to take things out of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. But I think it's more vivid for most people if you talk about songs, if you talk about popular TV shows, etc. That's getting harder for me because I'm in my 50s and there is so much media these days. I don't listen to contemporary popular music anymore. You can only watch so many TV shows. And so it gets hard because things are more fragmented than they were when I started writing. But still, there's definitely that. You have to meet people where they are. And then there are little things that you learn that are so counterintuitive. And so, for example, in my earlier work on language, I used to cite actual words and sentences from other languages a lot because that fascinates me. I gradually realized, after a few people who were close to me even told me, most people don't want to know what the word is. Most people don't want to read a sentence in another language, especially if it isn't French or Spanish. And so I started learning, for example, to write that, in Mandarin, the way to say next month or last month is to use the words for up and down. Nobody cares who doesn't speak Chinese that the words are shang and xia. So I think don't even write it. Certainly don't write the character, because that means nothing to most readers. But don't even write it in pinyin. Nobody cares that it's shang and xia. Just say the words for up and down. That is better media writing than giving the word because I find it fascinating that there are other words. You learn those sorts of things gradually. And after a while, people start saying that you're a communicator. But basically, it's a matter of seeing what people respond to instead of just saying what you want to say. I actually had an editor. It was in between, I think it was in between Language Hoax and Words on the Move. I had an editor who very nicely told me over lunch, you probably don't want to write any more books about how wonderful the languages around the world are. He said, what most people want to hear is something more local. And that kind of hurt my feelings a little bit, but he was right. The Power of Babel is probably my favorite of my books. And a certain type of person reads it, but it's a language nerd who reads that book. My book, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, about English, did much, much better and is still in print. And that's because it's about English. And I've learned to just make my peace with that.
Thank you. And I think you've already touched on my next question, but I'll present it anyway to see if you have anything you'd like to add. And my next question was, do you have any advice for language researchers like us who to be able to make our work more accessible to a wider audience?
Yeah. Pay very close attention to the difference between communicating to ordinary people and jargon. Avoid jargon as much as possible. And that means don't introduce the jargon gradually. Avoid it. There are certain terms that linguists use, that educators use, that the general public just doesn't need. And so, for example, in Words on the Move, what that book is me trying to teach the general public about how language changes. That is a lesson in diachronic linguistics. I probably don't use the word diachronic in it. In that book, I am trying to get across what grammaticalization is, which is something that linguists have been studying for about 40 years. I barely use the word. I just show that words come together and something that was a free word becomes a suffix, and isn't that neat? And I just leave it there. I don't then say, what I'm getting across to you is grammaticalization theory as constituted by Winifred Layman in an article in blah, blah, blah. They don't need to know that. And so basically what you're trying to get people to do is think differently. And that doesn't require taking people into the library. You're just trying to make them think differently. So I avoid the jargon. And I also work very hard to make people understand that, I just lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. I work very hard to distinguish between what interests us and what the world tends to need to know, because academia is a strange thing. We're putting bricks and we're building this wall, but a great deal of it is only of interest to us, and it should stay that way. And the problem is that if you're getting things across to the public and you're putting a lot of effort into that, you're going to hear from people who are less interested in that you're not doing the real thing. And so there are aspects of linguistics, especially with phonology, with the way sounds interact and the way sounds change. The public could never be interested in most of what phonologists do. And so I don't write much about sound change, not because I don't get it, but because nobody will ever care about that. It has very little practical implication. But that means that somebody might look at my work and say, well, he's not the real thing because he's not writing about coronals. He's not, putting spectrograms on the page, et cetera, et cetera. No, I'm not, because nobody will want to read that. And so that means that you have to make that choice. I try to do quote unquote real work on the side, but if you're being a publicist, you're not going to do as much of that as a lot of people. So you have to decide how you wish to be seen. But it's important, I think, to try to give the public something. To just sit in our studies it's a little unfair in a way. There are things that more people need to know.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we're actually at the very last question, so we've been very efficient. So the last question is about if you have any advice for junior scholars like us. Do you have any advice or words of wisdom for junior scholars in linguistics or those who are interested in language in general?
I do have advice of that kind, and that is that I think we live in an era where it's becoming less true than it was that the general public doesn't know anything about linguistics. There are podcasts, you can blog, quote unquote, you can tweet. There are ways of getting things across to the public that there didn't used to be. It used to be you had to write a book that nobody would read. Now there are many more ways to get things across to the public than writing books. And I think that we should use those things as much as possible. And to be honest, what I'm trying not to say, but frankly, those are the things that often you should say. I think it's really important for young linguists not to get caught up in a current that I'm seeing lately, which is to yoke linguistics to hard left social justice ideology. Hard left social justice ideology is very important in itself. I don't disagree with the basic tenets of it. But a linguistics that's only about that and excludes other perspectives, that is focused only on advocacy as opposed to just description and just the sheer wonder of a subject in itself, there's a danger there because it means that not as much gets done. And frankly, it means that the public is less interested because a linguistics that's focused only on advocacy is mostly of interest to people who are doing that kind of linguistics. It's limited. And so I don't mean that linguistics shouldn't search for the good. And so a lot of my work on Black English is trying to disabuse people of the idea that Black English is a bad thing, for example. I'm very committed to that. But I worry that nowadays, if you're coming into linguistics, you might be taught that if what you're doing isn't about trying to make the world a better place, and often isn't about you and your linguistic experience and speaking your own narrative, that you're somehow not doing the job. That to me is a very narrow way of being an academic subject. I worry that that might affect the way younger people are coming into the field. The field should be about curiosity. The reason that you become an academic is because you're curious, you want to learn new things. And there are more new things to learn than the ones that are about advocating for the downtrodden. I think that should be one of many things that people are genuinely interested in. So there's that. That is what I really feel in answer to that question.
That's so interesting because I'm thinking about how like we've been trained to publish and to write journal articles and they're really long. And then you're talking about these like outlets like using Twitter or blogs that are much shorter and it's a completely different form of writing.
You know, another thing actually about academic articles, we should write them shorter. I think that we're trained to write these 35-page articles with these dense sentences because that's what everybody does. And frankly, that is partly a product of the old-fashioned term word processing. It's easier to write that way on a computer keyboard. You notice older papers were shorter because you have to write them out in longhand and type them. We write too long. And I think that even when we're writing to each other, our papers are so long and so dense that almost nobody but super specialists in what we do ever read the papers. Often you do this whole paper that goes through peer review, and 10 years later you realize that nobody read it except the editors and the reviewers because it was just too long. So I try to write my articles shorter now, even for academics. So I know that nobody in the general public is ever going to see them, but we should be more concise even in the way we communicate with each other because there's an awful lot of just empty verbiage that we throw at each other. And I am quite guilty of it. My papers in the 90s and the early 2000s, I have these 40-page behemoths. And I've gradually realized no one ever read them because they were too long. What was the point? They should have been half of the length. And so I try to do that now.
Thank you. It's very interesting. And that wraps up our questions for today's interview. Thank you so much, Dr. McWhorter, for joining us. It's been really fascinating and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you for your questions. Happy to help. And yes, have fun out there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.